So greeting friends, my name is Eli Sachs. I'm the director of the Jewish Publication Society, and I'm here today with Rabbi Barry Schwartz, the director emeritus of JPS and the author of the wonderful new JPS book, Open Judaism, a guide for believers, atheists, and agnostics. For those of you who haven't yet read it, it's really a theological tour de force. It's kind of a count of the breadth of Jewish belief in theology, past and present, a clear and accessible and usable presentation of diverse Jewish views on a range of topics from a range of perspectives. The book discusses themes from God to the soul, from Torah to halakha, from identity to inclusion, from Israel to ethics to prayer. And it does so by exploring how these topics might be understood from traditional, liberal, and secular humanistic perspectives. Rabbi Schwartz, thank you so much for taking the time to speak and think together today and for writing this wonderful book.
Well, thank you. That was a great introduction, by the way. I appreciate that. And above all, this was meant to be a grand tour of contemporary Jewish thought. You might think that there's plenty of resources out there that give you a glimpse at the entire breadth and diversity of Jewish thought, but it's not true. And there's such a beautiful coat of many colors. There's such an array of Jewish thought, and I wanted to bring it all to the attention of the readers.
No, and that really comes through in the book, both the breadth and diversity that you highlighted, but also how passionately you feel about this, right? How much it's the case, as you said, that you wanted to provide this, that it matters to you. And we're going to think a little bit about why providing this grand tour matters so much to you and sort of to society as a whole. So let's begin kind of with an overview of the book itself to kind of help orient readers. So on the back cover of the book, your book is described as follows, and here I'm quoting, Open Judaism offers a big tent welcome to all Jews and Judaism. It's at once an invitation to the spiritually seeking Jew, a clarion call for a deeply pluralistic and inclusive Judaism, and a dynamic exploration of the remarkable array of Jewish thought within Judaism today. So what does that mean? What are you calling for when you call for a deeply pluralistic and inclusive Judaism? And how does your book empower readers to participate in that kind of vision of the Jewish tradition?
I'm a person that believes that ideas really matter. And I argue in the book that what we believe, our ideas about our faith, really matter as well. It's remarkable, but many people shy away from systematically thinking about this, but sharing their views as well. It's not so easy for many Jews and many other people to talk about their views of God, their views about the soul, what they feel about prayer, and some questions of identity, anything that skirts religion or directly is involved. And so this book, if you notice in the subtitle, is a guide. It's not telling you precisely, here's the truth, here's what's a value, but it's a guide to talking about these subjects and from many perspectives, because as I enter my 40th year in the congregational pulpit, I've realized that many students, many congregants are caught in a bit of a cognitive dissonance between secular viewpoints they hold and the teachings of their religious tradition. So this is meant to open up in a new way the fact that many of us are in the middle. We're trying to synthesize between different worldviews, the classic worldviews that I talk about in the book of Athens, of reason, and Jerusalem, of revelation, of secularism and traditionalism, of faith and reason. So to my mind, we emerge from this the richer for it and with a greater respect for the diversity of thinkers that are not necessarily well known. Finally, I do believe that if we are pluralistic in our outlook, regardless of where we land personally with our beliefs, we'll get along better. We'll be more open to the diversity of viewpoints, and we'll be more prone to seek common ground. And I think we can all agree that in our communal Jewish life, in our societal life, we need to strive after a greater sense of unity and common purpose.
So that's really powerful, Rabbi Schwartz. And I'm hearing a number of different themes there. There's the kind of diversity of perspectives that the book explores. There's the need for this kind of guide to diversity. And then there's the need to be able to kind of build the skills, even having these kinds of conversations. And maybe we can kind of take each of these in turn. So one of the things you pointed out is that the book is really a guide. So you go through different Jewish views on all the topics that I mentioned earlier. You also then provide almost model kind of statements of belief from different perspectives for traditional Jews, for believers, for atheists, for agnostics. And this vision of pluralism is pretty far-reaching. I mean, almost sort of shockingly so. You write in one point in the book that in this vision of open Judaism, there's a place not only for all Jews, but also for all Judaisms. There's a place not only for traditional Jews, but for traditional Judaism, not only for Jews who are atheists, but for atheistic Judaism, not only for Jews who are agnostic, but for agnostic Judaism. Could you say a little bit more about this kind of radically pluralistic vision? What do you mean when you say that open Judaism has space not only for different kinds of Jews, but also for different kinds of Judaisms, for, not just traditional and atheistic Jews, but for traditional and atheistic Judaisms? What does that even look like? What's atheistic Judaism, for example?
Let me first say that another premise of this book is empowerment through knowledge. So, I am convinced that the more people know, the better informed their choices will be. You may have heard it say that the great command of our day is not so much let my people go, but let my people know. And so that's foremost in my mind. But you zero in correctly on something. We all kind of acknowledge that the Jewish people is a big tent people. And we all know and welcome people who call themselves secular Jews, observant Jews somewhere in between those poles. But I do go a major step forward. How many times, have we heard somebody say, I'm a proud Jew, but I'm not religious. I'm secular. Many of those individuals may not appreciate that there's a whole spectrum of viewpoints, including a cultural secular Judaism, but that even within atheistic thought today, I distinguish in the book between what philosophers called hard atheism and soft atheism. So I have a section in the book, God for Atheists. On the one hand, you may say that makes no sense whatsoever. That's ridiculous. On the other hand, if you delve deeply, you'll see that individuals who have been called secular, like Spinoza himself, had a concept of God, a more pantheistic God and nature together concept. Now, that's not traditionally Jewish. That's beyond the bounds of traditional Judaism. But there's a whole school of humanistic thought that is based on these notions and is in debt to Spinoza. And then there's an allied school, and this also directly relates to your question, that the philosophers call religious naturalism, that says that God and nature may be separate, but God works through nature, not above nature. Well, guess what? A major thinker of the 20th century named Mordecai Kaplan adapted this viewpoint in a daring new theology, which later became Reconstructionist Judaism. It's amazing, but many people don't know about the theology of Kaplan to this day. But here was an attempt to synthesize between the rationalism of Athens, if you will, and the religious revelation-based truth of Jerusalem in a new way that says, yes, we do affirm a belief in God, but somewhat of a more limited notion. Eli, I just gave a sermon the other week in tribute to a great rabbi who just passed away. His name was Harold Kushner. And his claim to fame was a massive best-selling, maybe the best-selling book of Judaism in recent decades, When Bad Things Happen to Good People. Well, that book was based on the religious naturalism of his mentor, Mordecai Kaplan. I talk about both Kaplan and Kushner in the book because for some, this was an exciting new synthesis of the two schools. For others, it was not acceptable in the way it departed from tradition. But there's one example of even atheistic views of God is not so simple. It's not either or. And part of my mission, my self-declared mission in this book is to indicate to people the situation of belief today is not black or white, believe or not believe, traditional or atheist. There's a vast, fertile middle ground to choose different ideas, different approaches about God and everything that flows from belief in God.
So it's so interesting to hear you say that, because this is so different from what we often hear about belief in Judaism. You're clearly committed to the idea that belief matters, that theology matters, that talking about God matters. And on the contrary, what we often hear in Jewish contexts is very different. We often hear people say things like, Judaism doesn't require me to believe anything, or Judaism cares about what I do, not what I believe. Why do you take a different view? Why do you think that belief matters, that theology matters, that talking about God matters?
Let me say, Eli, that I'm in very good company, I believe, when I do so. I was just down at the Centers for Jewish History, a special exhibit about Maimonides and his legacy over 8 centuries. Maimonides, the great thinker, believed very strongly that creed mattered. He came up with his 13 principles of faith. In the Mishneh Torah, he begins by saying, here are the key principles of belief in Judaism. Maimonides was not the first. He was influenced by Saadia Gaon. Others came after him. Even in the Torah itself, it is clear that positions of belief are considered central. So this book is based on precedent, but also on the idea that modern sociology teaches us that beliefs that we're consciously or even unconsciously aware of do make a difference. While I do acknowledge that ultimately Judaism bases its judgment on our actions, on our behavior, I would say it's more accurate to say that creed leads to deed, rather than creed doesn't matter and only deeds matter. And if you permit me just to cite another contemporary thinker who I quote in the conclusion to my book, the columnist for the New York Times, David Brooks, writes, in the hurly-burly of everyday life, very few of us think about systemic moral philosophies, but deep down, we are formed by moral ecologies we are raised within or choose, systems of thought and feelings that go back centuries. We may think we are making up our own minds about things, but usually our judgments and moral sentiments are shaped by these long moral traditions. I agree. And I'm interested in exploring these long moral traditions as they extend back into Jewish history, but as they extend across the Jewish world today.
So the fact that you just quoted David Brooks there is really striking. David Brooks is not typically seen as a Jewish thinker, but one of the things you pointed out earlier is that this is a book that matters. You talked about it a bit as mattering because it empowers people, but you also said something earlier about it mattering because it will help us kind of get along better with one another as a society. And I think that really resonates with the fact that you're quoting David Brooks. Now, could you say more about that? Why does coming to grips with belief, why does coming to grips with the diversity of the Jewish tradition matter, not just internally among Jews trying to figure out what kind of Judaism they care about, but kind of to the world more broadly, to society more broadly?
Eli, my belief is that whether we are believers or not believers, or wavering believers, or sometimes believers, we all need a dose of humility. And that humility is that while we may have our own viewpoint, it's valuable, it's important to not only make room for, listen and make room for viewpoints contrary to our own, or different than our own, but then to wonder, can we assimilate some of that into our own thought? And collectively, can we reach a new point? I want to tell you that I'm working on a high holiday sermon right now. And when I tell you the title of the sermon, Eli, you're going to be surprised that this is coming from a rabbi, a man of faith, at the high holidays, no less. The title of the sermon is The Blessing of Doubt. And in that sermon, I'm actually going to say that doubt is not only a dirty word, not only not a dirty word, but it has its place in our religious thinking. A certain amount of self-doubt about our viewpoints will lead to a humility and openness to other viewpoints. And I'll also say that in the book, as you know, the position of religious agnosticism is not a badge of shame, but a badge of honor. I can't help but tell you that I won the lottery last week, not a big lottery, a digital lottery to see a Broadway show that's actually going to be closing soon called The Life of Pi. And in the opening scene, the young Indian boy named Pi is being interrogated by someone, and he asks that person, "You don't sound like you're a man of faith." And the man responds, "No, religion is a bad habit. I'm an atheist." And Pi says, "Well, I can respect atheism because that's a kind of belief also." He said, "But what I don't understand is how people can live with doubt." Well, that raised my hackles. I beg to differ. Actually, living with doubt, some doubt, is a healthy endeavor, a necessary endeavor, and it ultimately can help us make room for differing viewpoints and to have what our tradition calls a machloket l'shem shamayim, a debate for the sake of heaven, where we listen to others and ultimately, I argue, perhaps incorporate some of our differing viewpoints into a common position for moving forward. We are so divided in this country, politically, never mind economically or socially. We are so siloed into our own positions. And I can say that much of this applies to our Jewish community as well. How are we going to break out of that? How are we going to make some progress? It starts by constructive debate, and then I think it ends with constructive compromise.
So you've just given this really powerful, passionate, eloquent defense of humility and doubt and pluralism, and compromise. I also know that you have strongly held beliefs. You are a rabbi associated with a particular movement. You have deeply held views on God, on Torah, on Israel, on many of the topics you explore in the book. How do you reconcile these two sides of your intellectual and religious personality, right? How can you be such an ardent defender of pluralism and doubt and humility and compromise on the one hand, and such a passionate advocate for particular religious and political commitments and views on the other?
Well, you need to distinguish between being a preacher and a teacher. So when I'm in my preaching mode, that's an advocacy mode very often. And so, yes, I have unabashedly been a supporter of Reform Judaism, liberal Judaism, from the pulpit, in word and in deed over all this time. But when I step into the role of teacher, whether this is on the pulpit or in the classroom or even in the field, I do believe that a good teacher has a responsibility to give an entire survey of the landscape on whatever subject it may be. And so early on in the book, I indicate that I'm approaching this book as a teacher writing for students. And so I try, it's for the reader to determine whether I've been successful, to present each of the three basic viewpoints on the variety of subjects I explore: the traditional, the humanistic secular, and the liberal religious, in a responsible way, in a dispassionate way. So I think that a teacher has a special responsibility, to enable a student to see as widely and as deeply as they can in order to make their own informed choices.
That's really powerful. And maybe we'll conclude on that note of how this book can make a difference in people's lives. How can individuals use your book in their communities? How can all of us put Open Judaism into practice?
Listen, this is a book of theological ideas, so it's not light reading. I've been telling certain people, take a chapter at a time. Don't necessarily attempt to plow through the entire book. But like with some of my other previous works, this book is meant to be accessible, and it's meant to be used in the classroom, in a group setting, not only an individual setting. So I've actually built in a study guide to the book. It's a variety of thought exercises that an individual can do by themselves, or which I think will work very well in a group setting. I'm planning to use the book in my Shabbat morning Torah study. And, I'm saying to myself, am I going to do a year of theology with my students? Typically, it's the Torah portion or history, which I love teaching as well, which is very exciting. But, I do believe, even though my students will have to make that effort, but slowly but surely, we'll work our way through these different topics. They will lead to debates on almost every issue of relevance in the Jewish community today. But by taking one topic at a time, by looking at it from a diversity of viewpoints, and then by really doing some inner reflection and thought, students, and in my case, it's adult students, many of whom are older, wiser, with more life experience than even myself, will come to a better understanding not only of their own position and of the Reform movement or the conservative movement, the modern Orthodox movement, the renewal movement, but they will also see the opportunities that may exist for themselves and for their communities to come up with new approaches that are multifaceted. So my hope is that we'll engage some of the key ritual questions in Judaism, ethical questions in Judaism, questions of Jewish identity, of Jewish American-Israeli diaspora relations, better understanding those who agree with us, disagree with us, and perhaps showing the way to a reconciliation of opposing viewpoints.
Well, I think that's a wonderful note to conclude our conversation on. Thank you, Rabbi Schwartz, for the opportunity to think together today, and more importantly, for writing this book that gives us the opportunity to, whether we're going through it a chapter at a time, or, to use your language, plowing through the entire thing, whether we're reading it as individuals or in a community learning with others, giving us the opportunity to take on that difficult but crucial work of figuring out what we believe, why we believe, and how we can come together with others to be part of a community and part of a world that's able to think seriously about these kinds of questions. Those of you watching this video, please make sure, if you haven't done so already, to go to jps.org to get your copy of this book. It's really a thrilling read. And Rabbi Schwartz, we look forward to further conversations about this book and about so many other projects on which you're working.
I'd say to everyone, keep wrestling with the big questions of life, and thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you.